So a big welcome to everyone to today. Today we're going to do a review of each of the 12 weeks, and we're also going to introduce the concept of metacognition, which we've talked about before, but we'll go a bit deeper into that today. In preparation for this class today, I encourage you to read back through the notes that you've taken and the material that you've considered over the last 12 weeks. Begin to get a big picture understanding of this subject and what we've learned and what you'll be teaching. The reading for this class include Becoming a Critic of Your Thinking, where you reflect on the way you think and how you can think better, by Linda Elder and Richard Paul. And this gives you some insights into ways you can clarify ways you think for yourself, clarify greater self-understanding and how you can sharpen your thinking skills, but to sharpen them without losing those core values and beliefs you have, such as Christian values and beliefs, belief in God, other core beliefs that you might have about what's right and true. And there are other readings too, such as Gurm's Multiple Ways of Knowing. The Bible reading today comes from Ezekiel chapter 37, where we read about the passage in Ezekiel where we have the dry bones. And in this passage on the dry bones, we have this message that God's Spirit takes the prophet Ezekiel and places them in the middle of an open plain, and there's bones strewn across the plain. He led me round, lots and lots of bones, and he said to me, "What do you see?" And this reminds me of teaching, and sometimes there'll be some students, sometimes only one or two, sometimes more, who don't seem interested in the class that we're delivering that day. And this reminds me of the challenge of recognizing every student is a creation of God. Every student is valuable. And as a teacher, it's important that I bring life to them. Or in a youth group or in a church, it's important that life comes to people who are seeking life from God. And it raises questions for me as a teacher. Can every student in my class find life and value? It brings a message to me when I feel dry or down. How can I be renewed? Now, there are hermeneutics questions here that we could dig deeper into. That is, this is set in what we learnt in week 3 about an Assyrian invasion. 722 BC destroys the northern 11 tribes. And then 586, the Babylonian captivity of the remaining tribe of Judah, means that people could be dying without seeing restoration and hope. And this brings a message, general principle, that we have hope in God who cares for us. And this has application too, that even at the most serious point of our life, when we pass away from this life, we can also have hope in God. And in the New Testament, we see Jesus who brings hope even on the cross. And he goes to the cross in order to bring hope to mankind. So you might want to take a few moments to reflect on this passage and what it means to you, to reflect on the hermeneutics, but also to reflect on the meaning of the passage more fully and deeply. What's it mean to have God, who is above all things, speak into our life and bring hope and life to us? Let us pray as we reflect on these thoughts. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your presence in today's class and each of our classes and the classes we teach and all of our relationships and all we do to bring life and hope. And we pray that you would equip us to bring life and hope to others also. Amen. So one of the responsibilities that we have as teachers is to think well, and to think well, we need to be sharper in our thinking, more critical, more reflective, and have greater self-understanding. And this subject sought to increase your skills in doing this in order that you might pass that on to other students, and in order that you might develop skills in thinking critically and thinking well. To begin with, let's reflect on the concept of metacognition, which goes beyond thinking to think about thinking. And it involves thinking about the task, thinking about our planning and our approaches and our skills, thinking about the dangers, thinking about our motivations, self-understanding, what do we bring to the task. Metacognition, understanding yourself and what you're going to do. Secondly, it includes monitoring our progress as we go. Are we getting closer to what we're doing? We've gone to the library, we've gone online, we've gone to Google Scholar, we've got resources. Are they helping us, or are we sometimes going off track? So we go back to the question, we think about the question, we think about the skills, we realize we don't fully understand what's going on, we send an email to the lecturer, we ask, can you clarify, can you look over my draft, help me what's doing. And then thirdly, we evaluate and adjust and respond. And you will have had feedback from assignment 2 and other assignments. You're learning from those. You're thinking about how you apply what you have learned. Daniel, what do you think of this concept of metacognition that goes beyond cognition to think in a larger sense about what we're doing when we're thinking, and then how it's important for us not only to teach students to answer a maths question or answer an English question, but to teach them to reflect on what approach are they taking so that they are self-resourced to be lifelong learners. Daniel.
Yeah, it's something that I think at least I've realized that it's something that for a lot of us is automatic. Well, not automatic necessarily. That's probably the wrong way of putting it. But I guess it's something that we often do and don't realize we're doing it. It's at a bit of a subconscious level, which is ironic because the whole point of metacognition is being aware of how you actually think. And so what do I mean by this when I say that sometimes we do this at a subconscious level? So for example, I'm developing a subject at the moment in which one of the weeks looks at some study techniques and note-taking strategies. And really, this is metacognition because it's looking at what is the best way for you to think about something, to approach something for your own learning. And I think that's something that we've all done. You know, we've all sat down and had to study for a test, and we've thought, all right, how am I going to do this? Am I just going to write notes? Am I going to have flashcards? Am I going to do diagrams? You know, how am I going to organize my notes as well? How will I revise back over? Will I just read through? Will I maybe put my hand over certain sections and try and remember it? So I think that's the interesting thing that I find about metacognition is that we've certainly all probably had experience with it, but we didn't realize, ironically enough, that that's what we were doing. And so in reading about metacognition actually yesterday, a really good analogy that I came across was to think about metacognition as though there is a big brain above your own brain. And the big brain above your own brain is analyzing how your own brain operates and works and thinks and all that kind of stuff. So it's a way of saying to yourself, how am I taking in new information? How am I approaching new challenges? How do I process stimuli or changes, or whatever else? And are there ways that I can maybe improve this a little bit? Are there ways that I know, are there areas that I know I might need to work on or need help with? Are there areas that I think I've got strength in? For example, some people, when they think about, their own study habits, might know that they have a particular way of taking notes that they realize works really well for them. So metacognition is really interesting for those reasons, that it's something that we've all done, but ironically, we're not aware of the fact that we've done it. And the more aware of it we become, the better we are, because we're actually able to put strategies and tools in place to help us with our own study and our own thinking. There's an episode for anyone who's watched The Big Bang Theory. There's an interesting episode where one of the main characters reads a study about how there is a kind of perfect mental zone for creativity. They have to be under like a certain amount of stress. So they try and get themselves stressed, but just not too much, but just to the point where their creativity is working perfectly, right? That's a really funny but interesting example. There it is. Yeah, the anxiety optimization. So that's a fun but real example, I think, of someone using metacognitive strategies.
And so I think they're great points that you make there, that we need to reflect on our motivations. When are we going to be most motivated and why? We need to reflect on our strategies. We need to develop strategies, such as I prepare a weekly timetable where I write in Monday, Tuesday, etc. And I write in 5 a.m. if I can start working there, and 6 a.m. and 7 a.m. And I try and get that 20 hours a week that I can to do my study. And then I've still got 20 hours a week or 40 hours a week to do work. And a weekly timetable is one strategy that I use. And then I think about, when am I most productive? Some people are fowls, work well in the morning. Others are owls, work well at night. And some are able to do both. So I consider my study habits, and I consider when I think well and why. Is it a coffee that helps? Is it a walk that helps? What should I do every 1 hour to try and re-stimulate the brain? Every 50 minutes, do I go to a walk? What do I do when I'm teaching? So that every 10 minutes I re-stimulate the class, every half hour, every 1 hour. How do I stimulate the class, vary what I am doing? I also have a yearly timetable, and I think through when am I needing to focus on getting my assignments in. I like your idea about the brain above your own brain, or stepping outside of yourself and looking in on how you do things. That is, you become your own coach. And so you begin to think, how can I coach myself to do well, to do better? How can I improve? And what are the benefits of improving? If I can get good results, if I can get good strategies, I can do very well. I also think about speed reading. And so when I open up a book, I realize that I haven't got time to look at everything that's in the book. And so I try and think about, how can I speed read when I think these things through. And so here we've got the Big Bang Theory, anxiety optimization. This raises all sorts of interesting ideas, but I haven't got time to spend a lot of time looking at this. And so I might save the web address here at the top. I glance through the summary. Again, I'm speed reading. And so I could go off onto a side one. What do we know about Sheldon, etc.? I haven't got time to do that. I've got to go through and find the gist of anxiety optimization. I realize here that this is taking me far too long. I could do a search on anxiety optimization. That would be really helpful. But even better, if I go to the term anxiety optimization, that will take me much further, much better. And so, again, speed of gathering information is the secret here. So I've got mind optimization, anxiety as a resource. I'm speed reading this, wanting to gather the information. How can anxiety optimization help us to study? So helps us to study. Now, this is important. Do we want no anxiety in our classrooms? We might say that, but in education, possibly we want a little bit of anxiety. The marks are coming through. What's the optimization of the anxiety level that's not too little, not too much in schooling? So I'll put a few clue words in there, and I do a search on that. And so I'm looking for anxiety as a strategy in class. And so again, I'm wanting to get something that's got the materializing anxiety. Notice how these strategies of speed reading, gathering information are going to be helpful, and thinking about that. And then I find even better than Google is Google Scholar, where I gather information on this topic of anxiety optimization there, and what can I do to reduce anxiety in the classroom? Is it true or not? Some parents, of course, like anxiety optimization, others not so keen on it, are they? So you've got to think through, what are your views on anxiety optimization from that. So something to file away as either a rabbit warren that leads us away from where we're wanting to go, or a strategy to include in your classrooms. So self-understanding of your study habits, what leads you to do well. Some students like to leave their assignments that they're working on until the day before, and then to drink copious amounts of caffeine and to get as much energy going, and then to have a sleepless night and not sleep at all the day before their assignment's due. So that's one strategy. I don't recommend it. I think you're much better to take 3 weeks to do an assignment, to gather information gradually, to build up a resource, to then shuffle it through, to work it through, to go back and make sure you're on track. That way you're a well-prepared athlete of the mind, and you're going to get good results from that. So metacognition, this big thinking about your thinking, recognizes that we're not just looking at a problem or a question, we're looking at about how do we approach that problem or question. Does it create interest or boredom? What is the reason for the interest, boredom? We're looking at our levels of memory. When are they working well or not well? We're showing humility, recognizing at times we don't understand. And if you're learning something, you'll always be not understanding, because by definition, to be learning something new is to be looking at things that you don't as yet understand. And your students face that, and so there will be anxiety. You then generate ideas and hypotheses about what's going on and their strengths and weaknesses about that. You ask people who don't know, who have lots of opinions. That's one strategy. Or you go to good resources in the library with lots of references to the material. That's a better strategy. And you interact with others in a classroom or online. You seek to ask questions. And so my goal would be to ask a few questions every class that I'm a part of, but you don't want to dominate the class either. So you want to find what's that balance of asking just a few questions to show my interest, to stimulate my interest, as well as not dominating what's going on. So these are all strategies that'll help you to become better. As a teacher, you want to not only develop skills and strategies of thinking, you want to understand where are you working. For students, you want to understand that they're in a classroom that's got nice, attractive posters. It's got a nice environment. On birthdays of students, there's a cake, and there's a real positive atmosphere there, as opposed to a classroom that's got bare walls and no cake and a negative, critical atmosphere. You're also aware that there are other teachers and other subjects, and so you want to be aware of the curriculum. You want to be aware of the theory and practice of teaching, so ongoing through your life journey, you're wanting to learn about that, learn about behaviour management, learn about the topic you're studying. You want to create a climate where people are going to learn, and for yourself, where you can learn. You want to model learning. You want to collaborate with others, and you want to recognize in application there will be challenges there. So this is just one example on developing your practice as a teacher through metacognitive learning. So metacognitive learning involves knowledge and the brain, but it also recognizes the subconscious and motivations as well. It recognizes that there's regulation of how you plan and putting your time in and what's motivating you. And sometimes you need to get up and do a walk. Yeah, sometimes you need to raise your hand. Sometimes you need to get the students up and get them moving to stimulate the brain. So metacognition involves not only knowledge, but an understanding of what regulates our enthusiasm and our behavior and our motivations. It involves self-awareness, involves resilience, involves coming back, it involves the whole learning journey, doesn't it? Looking at the task, but then thinking about, has anyone done this before? And I found that whenever I did an essay, I'd like to see, is there some way I can see an essay that's been done in the past? And some teachers will show you one. And I think we'd be happy to give examples and models. Other teachers will say, well, I can't show you that one, but I can point you to one in a different area, or I can show you a journal article that models well the sort of thing we're looking at. So it's much easier if you've got a model to follow. You try doing a jigsaw without the picture, or a Lego without the plan, very difficult. And so if you've got the plan or if you've got the picture, then it's much easier. And it's the same with the students. If you can give them a model of how it's been done, then they'll do well. And so each of these steps, learning from last time, looking for structures and principles, knowing how to do things and working it through. Daniel, when you study a topic, write, which you do quite often, what are some of the metacognitive processes that help you to understand yourself, the best times to learn, the motivation to learn? Do you give yourself chocolate at any stage? What are the things that help you to understand ways in which you learn better and to understand students and how they learn better?
Well, I have to confess that I probably give myself chocolate at any stage, not just when I complete a task. So I'm very liberal with my positive reinforcement, but certainly show that that's a really effective motivator. And I think if I can encourage students, if you don't meet that kind of, that mini goal or deadline, self-imposed deadline that you've posed on yourself, the best way to move forward in that is not to withhold the reward, or pardon me, let me rephrase that. It's not to punish yourself, but to then switch to a different goal, a quick and easy goal that you can do and perhaps have a different, smaller reward, for example. So I'm probably not the best person to ask in terms of positive reinforcement, but some of the stuff that I do is I keep track of what times I tend to be most productive. Normally that's admittedly I find of an afternoon. I think I will use the morning often to do some kind of medial tasks or mundane tasks that can just get my brain into gear. Because I find I just need a little bit of that, almost like cognitive scaffolding, that I'm building myself up to that later task. So I find that works really well for me. One thing that I find when I haven't done this for a while, because I haven't had to study for something, but one thing I found quite helpful, because it improved my recall ability, was I would have all my study notes and I would get a blank piece of paper. So I'd have all my notes on a page and I'd get a blank piece of paper and pop it over the page, and I would go, on the left, I would have the definitions, and on the right, I'd have what they meant. And so I would slide the kind of paper over or down, and where I would see the definition, and then I would have to recall what it was. And just doing that, a few times really helped me to understand key terms. So there've been times where I've been aware of, what works best for me. Sometimes, admittedly, like recognizing that I work better of an afternoon after I've had some cognitive scaffolding, that's just come from experience, really. And so I'm conscious of the fact that perhaps if I was more proactive or more deliberate in thinking about how I best operate, I might have come to that conclusion a lot earlier.
And so that again shows the importance of understanding what motivates us, what drives us, what makes us most effective, and also the importance of understanding our students too are wrestling with these differences in their ability. You may have steps that you use to stimulate the cognitive scaffolding. Sometimes I'll show a video that stimulates thinking if I'm doing an English class or a science class. And some people are motivated by a biography and a story about someone famous. Others are motivated by questions and challenges. There's lots of things motivate students in different ways, and we must realize if we've got 25 students, we've got 25 different ways of approaching it, and some are doing people and want to be moving, others are thinking people, some are social, relational people who want to talk. And so we've got to have different ways of working with the different students in different strategies. We've got to think about the way in which we ask questions, and certainly this was a big emphasis in our first few weeks, is that rather than just giving answers, it's a good idea to ask questions to stimulate the questioning of what's going on in order to stimulate deeper understanding. And when we looked at the ancient Greeks and Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, we saw that questions are so important, and it's important that they're open-ended, not closed-ended, and that they provide a safe space for students to be wrong and students to have a go and to experiment. We also need to teach skills in learning to be explicit, not only in our planning, but in our expression. Instead of saying it means that, what do you mean by it? Or what do you mean by this? We get away from the pronouns to more specific detail. So describe the different strategies that are beneficial for you and beneficial for the students. Get the students to plan what's going to happen in the classroom, rather than just the teacher always planning. Get them to form an organizer that says, these are the tasks we're going to pursue, this is how we'll do it. Model the thinking. When you say this is a challenge that's come up, and there could be a behavioral challenge, or there could be a timetable clash challenge, model that. Say, look, we have a challenge here. How are we going to work through that? What's going to be the solution? And so that takes the pressure off you and shares the pressure around with all of the students, and they realize they have to take responsibility for what's happening rather than students versus the teacher. Evaluate progress. So think, how are we going on this? We got something that's due in. We need to speed this up. What are the strategies? Do we give more time to homework? Do we give more time to a particular task over another task? So ask the students to think about individually and collectively, what are the strategies to help deal with the needs that are there. Take opportunity to reflect on your own teaching practice and think about what's working. Think about groups and how you can make that work. Keep practicing and reflect on practice. How do we put things in practice? Ethics, think about how we put things in practice. Boyer originally described for teachers and scholarship the importance of clear goals. What's happening in your classroom? Do the students have clarity? Are you adequately prepared as much as you can? Do you use the appropriate methods that develop the skills that we're looking for? Do you get significant results from what you are doing? And do you effectively present what you are doing? From Boyer, Scholarship Reconsidered in the Profession of Teaching. So in this lesson, we began in week 1 at looking at what is critical thinking, and we began by emphasizing the importance of questions and a safe space to answer those questions, the importance of self-understanding, and then the importance of motivation and emotions as well. Over the 12 weeks, we developed a model that went beyond just focusing on the mind and epistemology and knowledge, to recognize that there is also value and worth and ethics and the individual, going beyond just reasoning to intuition, beyond just the senses of observation, to realize imagination and memory are important, and also the big questions of faith and God and prayer and worship, and also the whole person, including emotion, and also the importance of language. How important is it in thinking, in teaching, and also in study and going on in our studies to consider the whole person, Daniel, rather than just a brain on a stick as a thinking person? Why do we have to recognize that we are a heart on a stick, hands on a stick, sleep on a stick? Why do we have to consider exercise, every part of what we're doing, when it comes to the thinking task and completing essays and becoming better teachers?
Yeah, because there's so many factors and variables beyond the actual work that influences the work. When I first became a high school teacher, I had a particular class that in the past had struggled with homework, and I was talking to the head teacher about it, and he made a really astute point. He said that for a lot of the students, given the particular socioeconomic demographic they came from, they likely did not have their own laptops at home. Now, mind you, this was when would this have been? This would have been in probably 2013, 2014. So this was about a decade ago, in truth. That they would not have had their own personal laptops at home. There might have probably just been one family computer. Some of them as well would not have actually had access to the internet at home. So recognize that if you're setting homework that requires the internet or requires research, you're probably going to find that the vast majority of them won't get it done, not because they don't necessarily want to, but because they simply don't have the opportunity to. And so that was a really poignant example of the fact that there are deeper factors outside the immediate learning and the immediate engagement with information that can influence that. Now, you talked before as well, Sam, about, the importance of sleep, for example. We've all seen students come to class and, it'll be period 1 and they'll be falling asleep. And sometimes they're falling asleep because they're up till 3 a.m. watching Netflix. Sometimes they're falling asleep because they're up till 3 a.m. finishing an assessment. Regardless of whichever one it was, the entire next day is almost a write-off, really. And so what type of content is being taught in that next day that they might actually need to be aware of? If you're coming up to an assessment as well, are you getting enough sleep? Studies show that it's actually far better, rather than staying up to finish an assessment, it's far better to go to sleep straight away and wake up a little bit earlier. Because your brain at least will be booting up as opposed to shutting down. So I think, just some brief examples, but, thinking about the different, even just our diagram above, thinking about all these different factors, whether it be, we've talked obviously about sleep and some of those socioeconomic factors, but thinking as well about language factors. Are there students in your class, or are you yourself someone for whom English is not your primary language? There might be particular things that, because of that, influence the way you're able to, at this particular stage, approach new information that is written in English. Thinking about faith as well. Are we approaching a particular task with a kind of understanding that this is what God is calling us to do? Or are we potentially, depending on what subject you might be doing in your degree, you might be doing a subject where you think this has no bearing on what I feel like I'm called to do. Why, I just took this as an elective, but, I'm not really enjoying it. Or why is this subject in the degree, or whatever else? And that can be a bit of a trap to fall into, because I think the way I view it is that God is a God of wisdom and knowledge, and any gaining of wisdom and knowledge is a wonderful and beautiful thing. But those are just some examples of some factors and influences on our own learning that go beyond the immediate sitting down and reading of information.
So good, Daniel. A really great reminder that any form of learning goes beyond just engaging with knowledge to engaging with the sense of value and worth that we find in that knowledge, engaging with emotions and motivation, engaging with the language and words, and do we understand them, and what do we do when we don't understand? How do we get up to speed with the new words that we are working with, engaging with others in relationship, engaging with different cultures, and when we're teaching students from different cultures, how do we take that into account? Can we use our visual capacity to draw and do a mind map? Can we use the scientific capacity to look for evidence, or the historical capacity to look for things in the past, to think about spirituality and motivation and meaning and our relationship with God and Jesus and the Spirit? All of these contribute to the sense of value and sense of learning that we gain each time. Gurm said that we not only have empirical ways of knowing, such as science, when we observe and measure, which many students love. Some people are not so keen on that. They'd rather be in a literary class than observing and measuring, or doing chemistry or physics or other subjects like that. Um, that's one way of studying that's very important. And all around us, we have science and evidence-based information that's carefully measured. And if you can include that in your essays and assignments, the maths of the number of people, statistics of the number of people this happens to or that happens to, you'll be very successful. But beyond just what you can observe is that which is unobservable but true, like the maths of 2 + 2 = 4 being the same any part of the world. Very hard to prove that you go to another country that you could prove it, but the maths of numbers and geometric shapes and beauty and music numbers of an octave and tone and art aesthetics, all of these are about bigger theories and ideas that we can think about as well. Takes us into this invisible world that's much larger. And one of the things that I think we want in all our schools and Christian schools in particular is ways of thinking that go much bigger to include everyone and include all of the different ways of learning, including the logic that's behind the world, which we looked at in that week when we looked at maths. We need to realize that all knowledge also has an ethical component. And so you're not only teaching maths or science, but also you're loving people who are struggling with maths and science. So we have professional codes of ethical practice, laws that we follow, and then we also have the heart of that code, the spirit that we follow as well. Knowledge is not only objective, we look at things from the outside, it's also subjective. We're involved. It impacts us. We have values, and so we have goals which motivate us and guide us. We make moral choices. These are all part of our subjective experience. And Soren Kierkegaard says, so often it's the subjective, your thoughts, your motivations that are probably more important than the objective things that you write down as knowledge. So Soren Kierkegaard advocate the development of one's character and one's cognitive processes rather than just getting the right answers is important. Kierkegaard's emphasis on metacognition, thinking about the ways one thinks, says we shouldn't just be learning how to get answers. We should be learning how to understand how we think well, think ethically, think towards big truths that are important to us, that make a difference in the world. So as Kierkegaard would say, we need to go beyond just thinking to appreciating beauty and appreciating truth that is much, much larger than just getting some answers for a test or an essay. So the aesthetics is important. And we spent a week looking at music and art and aesthetics and beauty, and realize this can be helpful. Make your classroom a beautiful classroom. Make the class itself a beautiful experience. When you write a story or a poem, put some beauty in it. You might want to have some horror and some crisis. That drives a story, having a crisis, but you also, I think, find value in some resolution. And that might be the difference between modern and post-modern. Daniel, do we need beauty in the classroom, beauty in science and maths, beauty in an English class when we get students to write an essay or poem? Do we need the aesthetic and the appreciation of the beauty and appreciation of the subjective I'm involved? And it's not just an objective view of the outside?
I think so. And I think part of the beauty of no pun intended, part of the beauty of aesthetics is that from a pure base level, if you walk into a classroom, you will see, you know, if it's a classroom that is typically assigned to the same teacher or to the same faculty, you will typically see in that classroom a bunch of posters or art on the walls or examples of student work, because I think there's something appealing and there's something comforting about seeing things that are beautiful in the space that we're working in. If you think about, our own homes, for example, I don't know anyone, who doesn't have things in their home that brightens up or enlivens the space. And so I think from a very base level, I think that's something important to think about perhaps when, our students have their own classrooms. But as well, going beyond that, I think that the importance of aesthetics relates to what we're seeing here essentially, that there is a world, and like you talked about, Sam, there is a world beyond the classroom. And so I think the significance of aesthetics, not just at that base level, but if we take, for example, if we take literature and we talk about the particular beauty of a literary passage or a particular poetic technique that enlivens or enriches our understanding of that text, what that does is it opens up our thinking to what is going on really at a much broader level outside our classroom. In this particular text, this author might be looking at particular broad social or cultural ideas. They might even be exploring something that is deeply personal to them. But in identifying that through the aesthetics of the text, what we're able to do is essentially go beyond our own minds a little bit. We're able to journey outside of the classroom. And so I think, with that being said, think about whatever subjects, for those of you watching, think about whatever subjects you might be particularly passionate about, or if you're training to be a secondary teacher, think about what subjects are your specializations. What ways do you think you could, or how might it be important for you to have students journey outside of that classroom space, from a cognitive perspective? What particular scientists, for example, or notable advances in science might you be able to find particular beauty and meaning and significance in, and be able to relate that example to a broader understanding of the world in which we live in, a broader understanding of God, and even our place in that as well. So I think aesthetics is really important, not just at the base level, but I think thinking about how we can relate what we learn to our broader worlds and our place in it.
And another aspect that Gurm mentions is freedom and agency. That is, students need to be empowered. And if you've got a student there who likes to draw, use that. If you've got a student who likes music, use that. Like sport, use that. Listen to your students, find out about your students and where their interests are, and encourage them to have agency in all the subjects that you teach. So after week one, in which we reflected on the various approaches to thinking, we moved on to Plato and Aristotle, and we saw that truth does correspond to material realities, but subjectivity means that we use language to describe these material realities in various ways, which may or may not have truth about them. And so each week we looked at objective realities in science and maths and music and art, but we also looked at the postmodern idea that there are subjective realities. That is, there are ways that we describe things and look at things which may not be exactly the same way. And the classic example would be the settlement of Australia. So was Australia's settlement an invasion? Or was it a bringing blessing to the country? Was it a mission of benefit which brought hospitals and schools instead? How do we see the settlement of Australia? And so this shows that there is an objective truth. There was a day which Captain Cook arrived. There was also the day in which Arthur Phillip and the 11 ships arrived. And so we then have to think through, how do we understand the objective view of the history of Australia and the subjective view of the history of Australia? And there's truth in both. That is, there are events that have taken place that have brought benefits, and they've also brought harm and difficulty. And there are different ways of viewing this and describing this history of Australia over the last 200 years, 300 years and longer. And the same with all views of history and each subject that we look at. They have both the modernity view, which is the pursuit of objective truth, the post-modernity view, but that's your opinion. We all have different opinions. And then there's the traditional view, that is our older traditions look at the ways in which we seek to know and understand what's going on. And when it comes to indigenous knowledge, the knowledge of the Indigenous First Nation people, they have their traditions, but they also have people who want to look at different ways of viewing things as well. And so there are these complexities in understanding in Indigenous views, just as there are complexities in understanding in our modern Western ways of understanding the world. And in assignment 3, you'll tackle that further. In week 2, we looked at the ancient ways of knowing of Socrates, Plato and Aristotle, and we looked at the Apostle Paul, who stood also in Athens and said, people of Athens, I see that you are very religious, but I come to tell you about the unseen God, the unseen truths. And so people listened to him, and then Paul then went to Greek cities like Corinth, where he shared the message about these different ways of knowing to people who are already thinking about correspondence theory of truth, coherence theory of truth, pragmatic, it's true if it works. And then today we apply this in grounded theory when we think about how do we build knowledge from the ground up, from the evidence. Do you use grounded theory at all, Daniel, where you gather the very basic grounded ideas rather than looking at big theories? Or are you a bit like me, you like to balance the grounded observations with some big theories and knowledge collected from other people through the centuries?
I don't, but I have had experience doing it. So before I became a lecturer, I was a research assistant, and the work that I was assisting on was a grounded theory of church leadership, particularly related to volunteer motivation. And so that was a whole new world for me, because this was a social and cognitive study, one that involved a tremendous amount of field work, in particular qualitative field work. What I mean by that is, students will obviously be familiar with quantitative versus qualitative study methods. And so how this research worked was there was a number of probably about 5 to 6 interviews with senior pastors of mega churches. And so the number of interviews was small, but each interview was probably about an hour long. And so what my job was at the time was to do something in that in this particular field called coding. And coding is a really fancy way of saying finding the key words, key phrases, the most repeated phrases in that transcript, seeing how often they come up, in what context they come up in, and if any of them kind of interrelate. So this was really fascinating for me, because this was not a field that I had done, that I had worked in before. It was a research method that I'd never used before, but it's really interesting to see how these particular pastors conceptualized key leadership practices and theories. And so it was bizarre for me to go through this process where you are coming up with a grounded theory of church leadership, something that hasn't been done before. And so saying, what's all this information that we have here? How do we draw out the key and common components of it to understand this kind of common scaffold or common understanding of how all these pastors understand church leadership to work? So that's the only time I've used grounded theory. and it was fascinating, and it was interesting. In a way, I'm glad I won't have to do it again.
And it's so interesting that you're collecting quantitative results whereby you could have the number of times people repeat certain words. You've also got
Yeah.
wonderful qualitative results where you're looking at how people are describing the quality of what they do. And then you've got things that are way outside of the actual results, which is the motivation, the spirituality, the expectations. There's other contexts that are also very important, and it's so important to think of the context of the people who are being interviewed, but also the context of yourself. You bring your own biases and experiences and expectations. And some people, I've been to universities where you've got people thinking very positively about church leadership. Everything's thought in positive terms. I've been to others where it's very critical, and they say everyone's in for their own self-gain, etc. And so the expectations of the researcher and the experience of the researcher, the background of the researcher, all this comes in. And this reminds us in critical thinking, we're not only thinking about the work we're doing, we're also thinking about ourselves as teachers, as students, as researchers, and what guides us. And metacognition asks the bigger questions about who we are, where we are. In assignment 3, you talk about First Nations people, and they've got very different views sometimes to us Westerners who've got our particular way of looking at the world. So we have to at times include a sentence or a paragraph saying, I am a white Western male and I think this particular way, and there are other people out there who don't think the same way because they don't have the same cultural background or same upbringing as me. Socrates, of course, in the week on Greek thinking said it's important to ask questions always about why we think, how we think. And so don't stop with the answers. Keep asking the questions. And then Plato looked to the heavens and said, we also need to think about what's the meaning and purpose and where are we going with this? And then Aristotle replied, but we also need to think about the earth and how's it going to work in practice and what can we observe and see? And so these are Greek questions that then flow into the history of Western civilizations from the Hebrews and the Jews through to the Christians. And we then come to seeking to bring a Christian understanding of that includes love and care and the example of Jesus and humility and willing to lay down our self-focus at the cross for the others that we have a missional call to serve. We also looked in week 3 of the importance of recognizing what we read in the Bible or an ancient text or any literary text is situated in their town, and there are differences between what is written and knowledge, be in the Bible or any literary text, and us who live in our town today in a different world. And we look for the principles that bridge from the past to the future. And this study of hermeneutics can be developed further, and you can do further study of Old Testament and New Testament to do that. And you can also go to some great resources, such as if you were looking at Ezekiel, you could look at Ezekiel 37 in the interlinear. And an interlinear will take you to the texts in the original language. Hebrew reads from right to left. So the hand of Yahweh came upon me, and there we've got in the Hebrew Yahweh. And then he brought me the hand of Yahweh by the Spirit, the Beruah from the Hebrew Ruach. He brings me and sets me down in a land of dry bones. So we can better understand language when we better understand the words that are spoken. And this is just another one of many tools. You've got dictionaries for every subject, dictionaries of philosophy, dictionaries of education. You've got interlinears of ancient texts that you can read. It's worth being aware of the tools that you have to help you understand understand what's going on. In understanding Christian things, we certainly use the Bible, but we're also aware that we're a part of a particular tradition or church or upbringing, and a modern Western upbringing. We have experiences of God when we pray and we get answers. We have logic and reason. God gives us a capacity to observe and to see. So all of this contribute to our understanding. And as teachers, Christian teachers in the classroom, we bring a particular tradition, whether it be the Lutheran or Anglican or evangelical or Protestant or charismatic or Pentecostal, whatever. We bring that in, and not every student is going to have the same tradition as me. I went to visit Philadelphia once, and they have a tradition. When they go into a church meeting for 1 hour, the Quakers sit there in silence for 1 hour. So we should try that in our classrooms. And I think that's a great way of praying, sitting in silence. In week 4, we went on to look at history as a way of understanding traditions. And George Orwell warns us that people try and manipulate history and to describe it in a certain way. And he says in his writing, he wants to show through his writing the truths, to expose these truths about the way people manipulate history. And in the history of communist China or communist Russia or any nation, there's an attempt to manipulate history. And so we have to think about, what do we notice? Why do we notice? And then why has it changed? And then the example we used before was the history of Australia's settlement. Is it a history of invasion, or is it a history of what is being there? Daniel, do you have any thoughts on studying history? How do we get to the objective facts, and how do we balance that with a recognition that there are views there? And you've tackled that with American history and other histories as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky question, and the reason why it's tricky is because the traditional way this dilemma is approached is that we say that there are kind of indisputable facts about history in terms of, what year a particular event happened, maybe the figures from a particular event, or the year a policy was introduced and what the actual goal of that policy was. That being said, so that's the traditional way we say it. We say there are some, indisputable facts, and then the jostling for truth is about the interpretation of those facts. That's normally the way we kind of conceptualize that. That being said, though, there are circumstances in which some of those facts are actually disputed over. It could be the casualty estimates from a battle, for example. It could be the specific goals of policy. So one good example of this is in the causes for the American Civil War. This is a very political, very volatile area of debate that, in truth, I don't know that there's actually a tremendous amount of historical debate about it as there is popular and political debate about it. So I always point students, so that the debate concerns whether slavery was the cause of the Civil War. And the counter argument to that is that, well, the American South were just fighting for their independence and their own rights. When I come across this debate with students, I normally point them to the Declaration of Secession of the first state to secede from the Union and join the Confederacy, which was South Carolina. And in their Declaration of Secession, South Carolina very overtly and clearly stated that they were seceding because they believed it was their right to protect the institution of slavery that the North were unconscionably trying to abolish. So that's just a brief example of the way that I've had to encounter that. And in talking about that, hopefully I've been able to, in that limited space, show the way we normally conceptualize issues of truth, but how that's not always the case. Something as simple as, what were the causes for a war? We have to go back to specific facts, specific documents to look at that. So it can be tricky. It can definitely be tricky.
And amongst those, we have the primary resources. And if you're a biblical study, you've got the primary resources, the biblical texts. If you are doing study of a particular historical period, like the Civil War in the US of A, you've got the primary resources of what is written. And then you've got the secondary resources where scholars come along with their opinions. And these are important as well. And you're looking for the key thinkers, the key ideas in the secondary resources. And you're usually seeking to include a balance of viewpoints. That is, some hold one position, some hold a different position. And by showing that balance of viewpoints, then you're able to cover the ground quite well and to show that you have an impartial overview of what is taking place. And we looked at that in our week on history, and history is so important when it comes to studying any subject that you look at, including education and teaching. There are reasons why we teach the way we do. In the weeks in which we looked at maths and science, Peter Harrison has written on the ways in which maths and science and religion aren't constants, but through history they've changed. And science used to be study of the entire natural world that included prayer and character formation, but it was then reduced in the 1880s through to the present time down to a narrower study. And so in chemistry, we don't study everything that's going on. We organic chemistry, inorganic chemistry, and you get narrower and narrower in what you focus on. And so too, even in religion, we don't necessarily just look at the ways in which we engage with God broadly. We often say we are a Catholic or an Anglican or a charismatic or a Pentecostal or Presbyterian. And so we narrow down what we're doing, which in many ways is a bit sad in that it leaves out a lot of the truth, and often it leaves out the historical understanding of how we got here as well. We then went on to look at maths and saw how important it is, and that there's a beauty in maths, and we can gain a great deal of understanding of the language of God. There's many languages of God. One of them's maths. One of them is the language of each of the cultures. Another is the language of beauty and dance and the embodied nature of the human person. And it's important for us to understand all the languages of God. There's the language of relationships, the language of health. And we covered just one of those languages in the week at which we looked at maths. And then we went on in the week in which we looked at science, where William Whewell came up with this new term for science as the narrowed down, focused understanding of what we do. The contemplation of the material universe exhibits God as the author of the laws of the material of nature. And so if we can understand the laws of God in nature, then we can better understand the world around us. And so I think we have to understand the laws of maths, the laws of nature, if we're going to be wise. And the Bible encourages us to be knowledgeable and wise so that we can make wise decisions, and so that we can, in making our wise decisions, be responsible in the actions that we take and the decisions that we make. In the scientific method, we begin, as we said, with questioning, but we then go on to do experiments and what can be verified and repeatable, and what can be verified also through peer review of what we do. It can lead to progress in science, and over hundreds of years, we find these paradigm shifts as we begin to think in different ways, as Isaac Newton gives us understandings of gravity, and then each decade and each century we move forward in understanding what's going on by moving beyond the questions and observation to come up with hypotheses, which are simplified explanations, which have the strength that they're reduced to simplified explanations, but they have the weakness that there's a certain reductionism about them as well. And many of the scientists were Christians, and it makes an interesting study to think of how their belief in God, the lawgiver, leads them to explore the laws that give us wisdom as we studied. We also looked at language and literature, and which we began with James chapter 3. If we don't stumble in what we say, then we do well, or what we write, then it's like the bit of a horse's mouth or the rudder of a ship. Just a few words can do a great deal of good or a great deal of harm. And we saw that Lera Brodowski said, does language shape how we think, or does how we think shape language? What are your thoughts on this, Daniel? Does the language shape how we think, or does how we think shape our language?
Both. And I'll explain why I think that. I'm actually not going to refer to English literature here. I'm actually going to look at an example of the Indonesian language. So Bahasa Indonesia is a language that is only around 70 odd years old. It was developed in the 1950s because there were so many different languages and dialects in the Indonesian islands that there was no one singular language that all of the nation could use and understand and be united behind. And so this monumentous task of developing a language reflects a few things that I think humans think about in terms of language and why it's important. So it was heavily derivative of Malaysian. So if you can speak Malaysian, you can probably speak Indonesian and vice versa.
Right.
So the interesting thing is that Indonesian as a language is an example of not what happens when a language develops and evolves over time, but what happens if humans were to potentially start a new language from the beginning. What do we deem to be important? And so I think how we think shapes language, because there is ways in which that this language was developed that were reflective of particular ideas. For example, in Indonesian, some of the grammatical rules are quite different to English. So in English, if I were to, I would say something like, I washed my car, or I swept the floor. In Indonesian, that's considered rude, to put yourself before the object. And so in Indonesian, you would say, the car I washed, or my car I washed, or the floor I swept. The idea is that there is humility there. And so that is an actual grammatical rule in Indonesian. And to break that rule is considered quite rude. And so this is reflective of the fact that how we think shapes language. But also for people who grow up in Indonesia who didn't have a role in creating that language, for whom this is the only language they know, we see now that this language will actually shape how they think moving forward, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Now, I've got another question that flows from this. Is literature, good literature, able to be reductionist and just be entertainment, or just be scary? Or has that taken away some of the value of literature, Daniel, in that good literature should do more than just entertain, or just do more than scary? I think that's quite an important question, and the same with a good movie, or good music, or good poetry, or good art. Should do more.
We are diving right into the crux of complex literary theory. And so what I would say to that is, I would say that the current dominant theory in literary studies is a postmodern theory known as the death of the author, which essentially puts the reader in the position of power and significance. The reader is the one who determines the meaning and the significance of a text. So my answer to that would be yes, absolutely. If you as a reader think that, good literature doesn't necessarily have to engage with big and complex ideas about the meaning of life and society and culture, but good literature can just be a simple story that is really enjoyable and fun and funny and whatever else, absolutely.
They're huge questions, aren't they? Because civilization and life depend on this thought: are we here just to entertain, or are we here to address big questions about poverty, big questions about power, and many of those big questions there. In the week on literature, we also talked about irony and ambiguity, and the mother who says to the child, Joshua, what are you doing? And Joshua says, nothing. And the mother says, stop it immediately. So the meaning of the word nothing there goes beyond just what we would take as the meaning of nothing. And in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, where he says, what's in a name, that which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Does it mean that one person is a Capulet or not? Does your family name, your surname, have significance or not? And like you're saying before, for some, it has significance. For others who are madly in love, it has less significance. So the study of language raised all of these different questions. And as you showed a great example of, there are cultural dimensions which we want students to think about in their third assignment. Wittgenstein, in the first half of his career, wrote about the ways in which language sought to model reality, but then he had a break. I think he did some teaching and then came back, and then he went the other way. He said, in reality, there's so much influence from our culture and our background and our upbringing that so often that shapes the way we understand reality. A very interesting week in which we looked at language. And then the following week, we went on to emotion, and we said it's not just about words, it's about the way your emotions work. It's the visually, you can see it in a face, within. And one of the things that stood out to me is that you are not your emotions. That is, your emotions tell you something about what's going on in your social world around you. They indicate some ways to respond. And as teachers and as students, it's important to develop the skill of stepping outside our emotions to look inwardly and say, just because the dial says there are some reasons to feel angry, you don't have to express anger at that point. So the week on emotions I found to be incredibly valuable. Emotions tell us a lot how we're going, and then we also had opportunity to look at ways we respond. And we said that it's useful to get the students to reflect on what causes their emotions to change and their feelings of emotions to change, and how we would use those. What are your thoughts on the value of emotions, Daniel?
I think you've nailed something really important there, Sam, that we are not our emotions, but our emotions are a symptom of something deeper. And that's so important for us to remember, I think, not only with our own emotions, but that of our students as well. You know, if we have students who are normally pretty good, who are, you know, might be exhibiting behavior that they don't normally exhibit, you know, whether it's misbehavior or something else, that's normally a system of something deeper or different that's going on. It could be a simple thing of maybe they've just had a really tiring, difficult day. It could be they've got something going on at home. But emotions point us to something deeper, point us to something more than just what is going on at the surface. So understanding our own emotions, we talked about earlier, I think, you know, in this specific week in particular, we talked about that self-processing of, I feel this way, what is going on with me, and why am I feeling this way?
And it's so important to our self-understanding to have an understanding of the emotions, and it's so important to helping our students grow in their self-understanding to do what we can to get them to reflect on emotions. And we can use flashcards, and we can use an emotions thermometer, and we can use various tasks and various strategies to encourage mindfulness, clarifying thoughts and feelings, modeling persistence and determination, listening with empathy to one another, and emphasizing gratitude. And in terms of teacher anxiety and stress, just like student anxiety and stress, we can develop breathing practices, mindfulness practices, companionship and inspiration, and sharing with others, ways of caring for ourselves, exercising, diet, planning ahead, having lots of resources, and this can also be helpful. Ethics and teaching are also very important. That is, everything we do has an impact on the environment, on others, ourselves, and the person that we can be. And some people are well ordered, others are more creative and enthusiastic, some are more expressive, some are more quiet, and the same with students. And so we need to recognize diversity and difference. The truth is still there, but we play a different part in bringing a perspective on the truth that is there. And Russ Harris's mindfulness sheets can be really useful in reminding people of values, and we can each have different values. Someone can value sport more than another and one sport over another. Someone can value talking more than another. Someone can value being quiet more than another. It doesn't make one right or wrong, but it's important that we understand each other's different values and that we can understand how to apply this. In the week that followed, in week 9, we looked at diversity in our world and country and cities and schools, and recognise that we need to be aware of cultural differences. Big task in assignment 3. And if we can show empathy for people from different backgrounds, they'll feel connected. But if we don't show empathy, there'll be a strong sense of disconnection. So that was very important in week 9. Then we went on in week 10 and week 11 to talk further about groups and communities and the importance of understanding that there are benefits in working with others, but at times you want to work as an individual, and there are also benefits in working as an individual, but at times you want to work as a group. So the disadvantages and advantages of groupthink. And when you write an essay, if you can show a diversity of viewpoints, showing interaction with a larger number of people, groups of people, or if you form a committee, that will lead to a lot of success. And that then brings us through to this week, where we've drawn it all together and we've said that particularly important is metacognition, where we think about the big picture, the big story of what we are doing. So a great lesson again today. Daniel, enjoyed thinking about the big picture. It makes me realize God's made me big and complex. God's made the world around me big and complex, with more opportunities to achieve more than I ever imagined, but also some opportunities through my agency and freedom to get things wrong at times, but there is grace. There's others to help me when I fail. And hopefully the classrooms give more opportunities for students to achieve more, but at the same time, there's safe spaces for them to make mistakes. So thank you, each one. Closing thoughts, Daniel?
I think hopefully what we've been able to achieve throughout the semester, Sam, is I think I've seen as we've gone back through, we talked about, when we're talking about aesthetics, for example, we talked about a wider kind of application. And it strikes me in as we've gone back through, is seeing how much of this content not only serves as a kind of theoretical foundation for some of our students' later subjects, not just in education, but also in their specific discipline areas, be it maths or literature or science or history or whatever else. But I think as well, there's a tremendous amount of personal application here, thinking about the importance of recognizing our emotions, of the role of metacognition as well. And so I hope that at the end of the unit, what students will be coming out of this with is not just a foundation of critical thinking, of understanding their own worldview, the importance of their own worldview and that of others, wrestling with new information and truth and critically evaluating information, but also an appreciation of the different spheres and areas of knowledge and academia as well. And so, even if you are someone who, for example, goes on to do history, that you would understand as a result of this course some of the key ideas and thinkers in maths and have an appreciation for that. That you would also come out of this course with an understanding of what happens not only with students in your own classroom, but what might happen in your own life at home where you are experiencing certain emotions. How might that point you towards something? How it might enable you to think about the way you approach your information in terms of metacognition and your own study strategies, how you might use that, therefore, in the classroom. So I think, you know, my hope is that that's what students will have come out of the unit with.
So good. So it's good to be able to share with you as students. If you have any questions at all at any stage, do contact us, and we'd be keen to continue to support you in your journey. We're sure you'll do well if you put in the time, think carefully. With God's help, you'll be blessed in all you do. Thank you again.